I'm going to talk about faith and justice, and it's a relatively short presentation. It'll probably be 15 to 20 minutes, I'm guessing. So it won't be exhaustive, but here goes. I work as youth engagement coordinator for a faith-based NGO. NGO, incidentally, means non-governmental organization and refers to an organization that is not a part of a government and is not a conventional for-profit business. Before that, before I moved to Winnipeg, I was a pastor in a house church community in Kelowna, BC. While in Kelowna, I was also part-time campus chaplain at University of British Columbia, Okanagan. I want to talk to you about faith and justice. Before I get too much further into this, I want to offer an explanation or definition for the two words I'll be referring to this evening. I think the word faith can be seen as a synonym with the word trust. When we talk about faith, we're talking about what we believe to be true and what we trust. Sometimes, in efforts to bring people together along lines of belief, we get caught up in details that occasionally get blown out of proportion. What do I mean by that? Well, as an example, if we get into parts of the Apostles' Creed, an ecumenical creed acknowledged by most Christians, the original composers of it were wanting to succinctly put in words a statement about what it meant to be Christian. What we've done with it since sort of bogs things down. Like, Mary was a young woman and the mother of Jesus. Early Christians referred to her as virgin, and that got into our creed and Christmas story. And we've turned it into a sex thing. And we have even pushed that sex thing into a guilt thing for many. That's one example, without going into too much detail. What about God as Father? Or God as Almighty? Or Jesus' resurrection? Or Jesus' coming again to raise the faithful from the dead? All of those require a lot of unpacking, but we often don't get into what it actually means to be Christian. So in a nutshell, we have faith and all that means for different people. When I use it, I mean trust. So that's faith. Justice. There are two kinds. There is retributive justice, which has to do with the whole eye for an eye thing, vengeance, etc. I won't get into that this evening. It has little to do with Christianity, the retributive justice piece. The other kind of justice is distributive justice, and it has to do with the distribution of resources and power, equality, fairness, and all that good stuff. When we hear about justice in Scripture, it's usually the distributive kind. As in Micah 6:8, He has told you, O mortal, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you but to do justice, and to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God? Words of Jesus point to just living. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the greatest and first commandment. And the second is like it, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. So make sure the needs of your neighbor are met in the same way you would want your needs met. So, I want to talk about faith, what we trust and how we articulate it and live it, and justice, our work in the world so that all might have enough. To put it as a question, how does our living reflect what we say we believe? I ask that question because I think that sometimes our question is, how do we come up with the words to express our faith? And while words are important, and they are what we use when we find ourselves at church, I believe it's the deeds that follow which truly reflect our faith and that in which we put our trust. The shirt I'm wearing here is from Benin, Africa. My sister got it for me when she was there almost 10 years ago. I thought I'd wear it this evening because it points us to a culture outside of our own. Faith, when engaged well, points us outside of ourselves. When justice work stems from what we believe, we seek the well-being of others and consider what we have in relation to what others have, whether they're nearby or far away. And I hope that faith also keeps us mindful of the world or creation. Obviously, we live in the world and depend on what the natural environment provides. But we are also stewards of the earth and must keep nature in mind as we draw from it. There is such a term as earth justice or eco-justice, and it has to do with care for earth and what the natural order needs to thrive. So we don't cut down too many trees, we don't divert or pollute fresh water systems, we recycle, take transit, and all those good things. That's sort of earth justice or eco-justice. Well, I've got more layers on than what even a Winnipeg winter requires, so I'm going to take one off. Yes. Trying to do this. I didn't rehearse this part.
Think that wasn't good? No way.
This one cracks me up.
I too am taking off a layer.
It's a competition.
Whose is better?
I like it because it's a funny picture. Maybe Jesus played hockey, it's hard to say.
Probably not.
I'm gonna go ahead and wager no on that one.
It's also funny to me because when we talk about our faith outside of church, we sometimes try to use language we've heard in church. To my mind, that gets problematic really quickly. In essence, we have a language of our own in church, and outside church, people don't always speak the language. So we need to know what we mean when we use such words. What does Jesus saves mean? I prefer to talk about Jesus saving in the life he lived and the way he invited us to live. In that sense, Jesus' way saves us from the ways that are otherwise hurtful, discriminating, and wasteful. As Christians, we are still part of a culture that produces and consumes. Jesus invited people of his day and continues to invite us today into an alternative way. What we might ask ourselves is how we live out Jesus' way in a culture like ours. This is the organization for which I work, Canadian Lutheran World Relief. Since 1946, CLWR challenges the causes and responds to the consequences of human suffering and poverty in the world. And it does that through working through partnerships and so on. So we're not sort of at this solo in the world. We work with ecumenical partners, other church bodies that also do work that stems from faith. We work with partners that are also Lutheran as well. So on the African continent, you'll often find us working with and through ACT Alliance, which is a huge organization, worldwide, I should say, that works with different denominational bodies to get the most sort of effective bang for donated dollars. In South America, in Peru, we work through an organization called Diaconia, and we're able to do things like human rights and gender equity training, along with sustainable agricultural training as well, which gets people aware of how they relate with each other and how they are also stewards of the earth as well. So there's actually a lot of stuff that people in Peru are learning about farming that we could probably apply quite well on this continent, which we don't, like around organic farming, around ways of making the best use and most profitable use of small plots of land and so on. So it's pretty huge. I don't know if you can read that. Can everybody see that?
This shirt was made in Canada.
That's right. This,
It's orange.
it's orange. This shirt was made in Canada. Do you know where your clothes were made? Do we make intentional choices as consumers? I once heard a pastor friend talk about how we vote with our pocketbook. And it's absolutely true. Whether it's in our offerings, supporting the congregation and its programs of our church, or whether it's at the department store. We have power, but we often are caught up in a culture that is happy to have us remain kind of ignorant to that power so that we simply fall for marketing strategies. For example, who has a cell phone that's more than 2 years old? And I think you do.
Mine is
Awesome.
held together by scotch tape. It's a great
Did the last stop working, or were you convinced that a newer one might be better for you? And what I would tend to say about buying Canadian, in terms of what this shirt says, is that it's worth it, even beyond the notion that some might say it's protectionism. Generally, it means less shipping of goods around the world, so less carbon emissions and so on. It means that goods are produced following standards for quality and working conditions set by other Canadians. And it means we are using, more likely, resources of our own nation and hopefully not depleting resources from elsewhere. But that's a bit harder to tell with trade agreements as they are these days. We live our faith and we work for justice in the economic decisions we make every day, every week, every month, every year. And this t-shirt, by the way, was designed and printed as a campus club t-shirt for the campus ministry in which I was involved in Kelowna, called Peace Seekers. And I'm glad to see a Heinzman piano here. It's a Canadian piano. And I noticed there's G's magazine for sale here, which is Canadian content for Christian audiences. And it's produced right here in Winnipeg. So a, sort of an alternative way kind of magazine from Canada. Our treatment of people can also stem from a place of faith. This shirt has special significance to me. It was designed by a couple of fine arts students at UBC Okanagan, and we got to know each other through our connection and involvement in the Campus Pride Center. The words on it are "No love, no hate." K-N-O-W, love. N-O, hate. I wore it over a clerical shirt, so my collar showed at the top, when I spoke at the rainbow flag raising ceremony to kick off Out Week in February of the year that this shirt came out. As people of faith, we are called to justice work, which also means working for fairness in distribution of power and privilege. That means that we need to speak out for those who might not be able to speak out for themselves, often because they are a minority voice. We may put ourselves in harm's way, and we need to be discerning about that. We may invite the hostility of others if and when we speak up for those with less power or privilege in our society or the world. In effect, that is what led to Jesus' death. He was speaking out for the unclean, the poor, and the marginalized in his culture and place. He was seen as a threat to the systems that kept the powerful in power, and he was put to death for it. Do people know about Kairos?
Fantastic.
I think you do, Paul, don't you? Do you know the story behind this knot perk here? A little bit. If you don't, in short, was it about 3 years ago now? 2009, yeah. So just over 3 years ago. There was a memorandum that was sent among the CEDA folks who had been granting money to Kairos for decades and to its predecessor bodies that did actually approve an application for further grant funds, which would have kept work in the world going, but then one of the ministers in government put a knot in the memo in order to cancel that funding. So it was a very underhanded kind of way of doing it, and so the funding was actually cut. And it got in the news as well. You can look up stories about it fairly readily. Kairos has been around for decades, once called 10 Days for Global Justice, and has held up social justice and environmental issues on behalf of faith groups. The Evangelical Lutheran Church in Canada is a part of Kairos, along with about a dozen other church groups in Canada. In recent years, among the issues that Kairos has raised awareness and encouraged action are mining by Canadian corporations, usually in the southern hemisphere, which destroys communities and environment, bottled water and the waste that plastic bottles create, along with the threat of privatizing fresh water, which every person needs and ought to have access to, and the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Persons. We are Lutheran. We come from a place of deep thinking in our faith. Martin Luther, after all, was an educated monk who read about God's grace and decided the church needed to debate how it was living out the Christian faith in the world. This was obviously back in the 16th century. Luther ended up taking a stand for people when he saw the institutional church taking advantage of them in many ways, including the sale of indulgences in order to raise funds for the Pope to build St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. Nothing against the new Pope, who just, I guess, had his inaugural Mass today. Luther put the Bible into the people's hands by translating it into the vernacular, so it was no longer necessary for bishops and church hierarchy to be the sole interpreters of Scripture, which was recorded in Latin, for common people. Luther married a woman who had grown up in a convent and turned the idea of celibate priests on its head when he had a family. We are Christians who follow the Lutheran tradition, and our faith calls us to hold up the needs and concerns of others. Our faith calls us to works of justice. We need to hold up this life of faith more than we do, and then invite others into living in this way in the world. And as we do, we will change the world. I'd like to conclude by teaching you a short song. It's originally from Argentina, and I learned it from John Bell, a minister in the Church of Scotland. And maybe you've heard it. The words are, there's not many words. The words are, God bless to us our bread, and give food to all those who are hungry, and a hunger for justice to those who are fed. God bless to us our bread. And I'll sing it through once, then I'll invite you to sing it with me twice through. God bless to us our bread, and give food to all those who are hungry, and a hunger for justice to those who are fed. God bless to us our bread. God bless to us our bread, and give food to all those who are hungry, and a hunger for justice to those who are fed. God bless to us our bread. God bless to us our bread, and give food to all those who are hungry, and a hunger for justice to those who are fed. God bless to us our bread.